Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And thank you to our partners. We have two partners tonight, the Roseville Library and the Eastside Freedom Library, and we very much appreciate their participation. The Ramsey County Historical Society, and both of these libraries have been partners in presenting the History Revealed series of programs, and we are very grateful to be able to offer these programs virtually. And we're working on more programs for 2021. Links will be on all of our websites as we go forward. Please consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our other efforts. And there are some wonderful benefits to joining. You may find more about RCHS on our website, which I'm putting up right now. And you can see upcoming programs, information about our historic site, Gibbs Farm, which will be opening up again this summer, membership benefits, how to donate, our publications, and so much more. And the address is www.rchs.com, and also the addresses for the Ramsey County Libraries and the Eastside Freedom Library. They will have information about their open hours and their programming going forward. This program will be recorded and it will be available on our RCHS and the Eastside Freedom Library's YouTube channels within just a few days. So some technical reminders before we get started. Please keep your microphones and your personal cameras turned off, and feel free to type your comments and your questions in the chat. Peter Ratcliffe from the Eastside Freedom Library and I will be monitoring those, and we'll be sharing those with Dr. Egge at the end of the program. And then after we stop the recording, I'll turn off the recording, and you may turn on your microphones and cameras if you'd like to share something so we can all chat together more or less off the record. Again, feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat as we go along. The Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to presenting the stories and histories of everyone in our community, and we are so pleased to bring you tonight's program. So I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Sara Egge. Sara is the Claude D. Pottinger Professor of History at Central College in Kentucky. She received her PhD from Iowa State University. Sara is the author of the award-winning book, Women's Suffrage and Citizenship in the Midwest, 1870 to 1920. Pictures on the screen. She also serves as the president of the Midwestern History Association. Her research examines how the women's suffrage movement intersected with immigration and the nativist sentiments that accompanied its rise. Sara teaches courses on women's and gender history, as well as histories of citizenship, food systems, and environments in the US. She is originally from South Dakota. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sara Egge. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you very much, Robin, for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to just very quickly share my screen and get my presentation up. And we'll begin. I look forward to your questions and comments. I'll just begin by talking briefly about this question that Robin brought up that I was thinking a lot about and sought to answer in my research, which was about how women's suffrage intersected with immigrants and the rights immigrants had in the Midwest. And today I'll talk more about Minnesota, but I can talk about other states as well. And thinking about how citizenship, the status itself, the sort of legal questions about it, but then also the customs and the cultures around citizenship, how those changed and what the meanings were at this time. And really women's suffrage allowed me to really grapple with a lot of these significant questions. So the first thing I want to do is show a map. I think maps can be really helpful to situate us in a broader context. This is a map from 1919. And I'm going to put my screen down so that I can see. This is from the National Women's Suffrage Publishing Association. And what you can see here, this is toward the end of the women's suffrage movement, the fight for enfranchisement. And you can see there is a key at the bottom, so you can kind of look and see and compare different states. By 1919, there were more states, certainly, that had some sort of suffrage for women than did not. There were still a number, as you see, that the Black color, many of them in the East and in the South still had no suffrage for women. But a lot of Western states certainly did, as you see, and the dates are listed on there. And then in the Midwest, there was certainly a change. One of the things I want to start us thinking about is the fact that this change by 1919, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois is a little bit earlier, but this was all a very rapid change in a region that had a long history of opposition, very clear opposition to women's suffrage. So when we think about the timeline, a lot of the greatest changes in favorability of women's suffrage happened in a very short period of time, especially considering that women's suffrage in the Midwest and in Minnesota spanned over 5 decades. It was a very long fight for enfranchisement. So the final tip really was something that happened fairly rapidly when we put it into that context. So this map gives us a sense of the broad national and then state by state fights and the ways in which the Minnesota and the Midwest might fit into a broader narrative of women's suffrage. I also think it's important to also remind ourselves that there is a national organization that was started right after the Civil War. There were actually 2 of them, and then in 1890 they united to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which was the combination of 2 other national associations. The reason of their divide was because there was a disagreement about whether or not we should support enfranchisement for Black men, especially when a lot of the laws that were being passed after the Civil War, especially the 15th Amendment, it did not enfranchise women, but it did enfranchise Black men. That was really the main reason. There were other issues, but that was the main reason for the split. But in 1890, they reunified. And really at the helm of this organization were these 2 women. There were other very important national leaders, but I think beginning our story and reminding ourselves of the power that these women had to shape questions about citizenship and women's suffrage and immigration, questions about immigrants and how they fit into the story is really led by these 2 women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. There's certainly other voices, but theirs were quite prominent. And in part, one of the reasons why is because they start writing their own history as the movement is unfolding. And in the end, they'll publish 6 volumes of the history of women's suffrage. And for a long time, those volumes stood as a definitive history, at least what they seem to be a definitive history of the fight for enfranchisement for women. And it took some time to unravel that history and then start to challenge it. And what has happened, my work and other work about the Midwest and the South and other places, also looking at women of color, communities of color, whether it's Indigenous or African American, Asian American, looking at different individuals and how they came to suffrage, it started to challenge that single dominant narrative that was dominated by national leaders who were often white and elite and educated and had ties to primarily the Northeast, although there are some exceptions there. So that's another, I think, important point when we think about the broader context. Now, this other leader that I want to talk about is Carrie Chapman Cat. She is a native of the Midwest. She's born in Wisconsin and she grows up in Iowa. She does join the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or what we say is NASA, and begins in the late 19th century advocating and organizing for the organization. And then by the early 20th century, she will become the president, sort of the handpicked successor of Susan B. Anthony. And while she has Midwestern roots, she very much sees herself and works within the national organization. She moves to the East and she sort of directs the organization in the same or similar ways that her predecessors had. And once again, a lot of the ideas that Cat and others have they're thinking at least that they're passing them down to women across the country, trying to create a cohesive movement. But one of the things that my research and other research shows is that this movement was not necessarily always unified. There were certainly people who challenged the authority of Cat and others. There were disagreements about the best strategies. And what we'll see in the Midwest is there are a particular set of circumstances that local activists have to adapt to and think about, just as there were in other regions and other states. And one of the things that I think is really important, that we need to really understand women's suffrage in a state level or even a local level context to really understand it, and what it meant to people and how they thought about it. The other side of when we do that is we get to see what ordinary people thought, people who are not necessarily leaders, but were advocates, and how they came to their suffrage activism and how they ultimately saw themselves, especially ordinary women from a variety of backgrounds, how they saw themselves within these broader political issues. One of the things that we do see forming by the 1890s among NASA and national leaders is this question of fitness, of who should be voting. Women are increasingly finding that their arguments that women should vote because they're equal to men, and sort of this individual liberty argument, they're finding that that's not working very well, that it's not winning them amendment campaigns in various states, that it's not necessarily a favorable or popular idea. So a lot of what they start to do is reformulate their message. One of the messages they borrow is from the WCTU and other women's groups like the General Federation of Women's Clubs, who are increasingly arguing for the ballot, out of this sense that women have a moral role to play in politics, that women's moral vision is something that they can then capture and use. We'll see this later in the early 20th century with calls for municipal housekeeping, where we can take our domestic identities and bring them out of the home and into the streets and into businesses. And we can clean up the cities and we can clean up our governments and use the same techniques as we do in our homes. So we see some of that shift in terms of messaging. But there's another message that suffragists continue to champion and increase it over time, and that's a white supremacist argument. In the South, a lot of this is directed at Black men or Black communities, and we see a lot of Southern suffragists, white suffragists, arguing that women should have the right to vote because they will take the place or they will override the votes of Black men as part of this white supremacist narrative, just as Black individuals are being disenfranchised during the Jim Crow period. So this is happening in the South. In the Midwest, it starts to happen. It's a little bit slower, and it doesn't necessarily target Black individuals. In this case, it targets immigrants. And so this vision, thinking about nativism as a potent force in the women's suffrage movement, really challenges our way of thinking about, again, that intersection of women's suffrage and citizenship and immigration. And so there's an illustration that kind of captures this. And I think it doesn't totally include immigrants, but it includes thinking that certainly was being applied to immigrants. This is an image that emerged in 1893. It was actually commissioned by the president of the Kansas State Suffrage Association for the Chicago World's Fair. And the woman in the middle is Frances Willard, as you see in the caption. She's the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she's surrounded, as the title indicates, by her political peers. And the quote comes from the text at the bottom: idiots, convicts, the insane, and Indians. And the argument here is a pro-suffrage argument that is steeped in rhetoric about capacity to contribute as citizens. The idea here in this case is there are certain men, individuals, who are contributing with their votes to elections, and they do not have the capacity to do so. And there are women who do, who are educated, who are elite, who are moral, who have this growing vision of using the ballot to protect the homes and make their communities safer and cleaner and more healthy, women like Frances Willard. And so they're using this argument here. Now, certainly we can see there is a racial component to this image, but this also goes deeper. White supremacy is much more broad. I think we often think about it in terms of race, which it certainly is, but it also filters into conversations about capacity. And it also racializes particular ethnic groups or other groups, especially in terms of class. In the Midwest, it's not on the poster, but we certainly could include immigrants. And in particular, the group that increasingly becomes vilified are Germans. Germans are not necessarily considered white. Whiteness at the time, that standard was more often considered to be Anglo-American. And so Germans did not share that background. And so the argument was that they were unfit or that their participation was a problem. There's another point, and I was discussing this as people were coming into the meeting tonight. There's another point that also raises the stakes for suffragists at the time in the Midwest. In many Midwestern states, immigrants could vote before they became citizens. This is a policy called declarant suffrage or alien suffrage. And in states, it's a state by state rule. State constitutions would basically give immigrants the right to vote after 2 years of living in the United States. They would go to a court and they would take out what's called a declaration of intention. And the declaration of intention is unique to the United States. And with that declaration, the immigrant says, I intend to become a naturalized citizen after the full residency period is complete, which is a 5-year period. So 3 years after the 2 years to get the declaration of intention. That was a promise that they made. And with that promise, the state would give them the right to vote. And Minnesota was one of those states. Until 1898, it enfranchised non-citizen immigrants. So did Wisconsin, so did South Dakota, so did North Dakota for a time. So there are a lot of states surrounding Minnesota that practice this alien or declarant suffrage. And even when states had this provision and got rid of it, enforcing naturalization to complete the naturalization process was very difficult. Until 1906, this was a state and local court issue, which meant that there was no standardization. So immigrants passed through the system often. It was very easy for them to never finish the naturalization process and have their declaration of intention, which allowed them to vote, and they were never a citizen. Or we have many cases where they never completed the declaration of intention and then just became citizens. And so it was very haphazard. And so that chaos also inspires Midwestern suffragists and national suffragists to increasingly use the same terms that they were using in the South for Black men, calling them ignorant, inferior, illiterate, uneducated. We see the same language being used by suffragists in the Midwest talking about immigrants, especially German immigrants. So I've set up a lot of context here. I want to talk specifically about Minnesota. This context is important to tell us that how women over time start to craft their arguments for the right to vote. One of the first, there are many women at the beginning of Minnesota's history who worked diligently for women's suffrage, but one of the first is a woman named Sara Berger Stearns, and I've included the quote that went along with this image so you can get the caption as well as the image. Quite a striking individual, I think. She was one of the first advocates. Her husband was a judge. They moved to Minnesota Territory. She's originally from New York. And she and a small group of women began the process of trying to push for women's suffrage in Minnesota. Now, one of the first tactics and one of the most prominent tactics they use are petitions. They try to get petitions. It's somewhat successful, but unfortunately, the Minnesota state legislature is very opposed to the radical cause of women's suffrage. And year after year, as they try to submit petitions or try to solicit legislators to hear bills and put forward bills to enfranchise women, in some cases, we have evidence that the legislators just laughed at them in their faces. There were certainly some closer votes in certain years, but overall, most people expected these petitions or these pleas to be losses, that they would be defeated and never see further movement through the system and become potentially an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution. So Stearns and her cohort sort of set the ground where they're trying to agitate within the political system, but they're certainly finding some defeat. Now, it's not all defeat. I think it's important to recognize that there was In the 1870s, there were some victories. Women in 1875 were able to vote in school board elections, which was at the time, something they really appreciated and thought that was a great victory. And here we have a picture of women standing in line to vote in 1908, or roughly at 1908. So again, we have evidence not only that women were excited about the prospect of voting in school elections, but they did. And that was a testament to anti-suffragists who argued that women would not vote given the right. And that was something that suffragists always challenged and said that they definitely would. But we also have in 1898, women are able to serve on library boards. And so that's another way that they can engage more broadly in kind of broader political and social issues. So there are some victories, although they are hard fought, and they're certainly not the goal that Sara, Berger, Stearns, and others had in mind of getting full enfranchisement in every election. One of the other things I want to talk about are some of the other issues that plagued or that shaped the women's suffrage movement in Minnesota. So in 1898, there was an amendment passed by voters in Minnesota that made it extremely difficult to amend the Minnesota Constitution. What this amendment said is that for an amendment to pass, it had to get the majority of the highest votes cast on any amendment during that election. So that made it very difficult if people voted no, or if people didn't vote on a suffrage amendment, which they often just didn't vote on it. An absent ballot, a non-vote was a no vote. And so basically suffragists after 1898 realized that the strategy of trying to petition the legislature to put forward a bill to amend the Minnesota Constitution and give women the right to vote, that strategy was probably not going to work. There was a lot of agitation after 1898. Certainly women suffragists continued to work on these issues. But what that amendment does is it shapes, I think, some of the contours of the movement. In other states across the country and in the Midwest, you see the development of somewhat stronger, and over time they become stronger state organizations. In South Dakota, the state organization grows stronger, especially it breaks away from its temperance organization in the early 1900s, and then it's able to gain strength. And you see this in Iowa and other places. But in Minnesota, this amendment issue sort of hamstrings the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association, which had formed in the 1880s. It doesn't necessarily give them that sense of purpose that it does, or the strategy that it does in other places. The other side of this, though, is it does allow for a constellation of organizations to be created. And we see a lot of women focusing on suffrage, but from their own particular identities, whether that's ethnic identities or racial identities or other identities. We see this in other states, but what this allows is for these other groups to actually gain prominence, and sometimes actually become more prominent than the state organization, which is a unique attribute of Minnesota's suffrage history. So one of these groups is led by this woman, Nellie Griswold Francis, and this is an image of her from 1924. She was the leader of the Every Woman's Suffrage Club in the cities. It's an African-American suffrage club. And what's really important to note is it became quite prominent. It was part of a broader organizing effort among African-American women, especially African-American club women, through the Minnesota Colored Women's Club Association. There was also a National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. So you see race certainly as a factor. This is not necessarily an integrated movement in any way. But you see the ability of these women, with the lack of a strong state organization, to really agitate for their communities. And Nellie Francis, as her biographers and as researchers have pointed out, there's a recent article about her in the Minnesota History Journal, which is really great, talks about how her activism really comes from her community. She doesn't necessarily call herself a suffragist, she is, but she talks about her activism as civil rights. It's broad and it's inclusive, and it's recognizing that her demand for suffrage comes out of her attention to the needs of her community, of the Black community in Minnesota and in the cities in particular. So I think it's a great example, reminding us that there are many different paths that people take to suffrage. In Minnesota, because of this unique context, we can really see those paths vibrantly expressed in the history of suffrage. Probably the woman who, if you've studied suffrage, you've probably run across her name, is Clara Euland. About 1915, she takes the helm of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association, which had, again, been working, but had largely been doing sort of behind the scenes agitation, had been doing a lot of organizing and connecting, but not necessarily drastic publicity generating actions. And Euland is going to change that somewhat. There are certainly other women, especially younger generations of suffragists, who will do so through the Minnesota Equal Franchise League. A number of young Minnesota suffragists will actually join with a suffragist named Alice Paul, who first joins NASA through the Congressional Union and then later forms her own party called the National Women's Party. That is very attractive to Minnesota women, especially young women, because they come from a state that had really not had a lot of significant suffrage activism. And by significant, I mean public demonstrations that agitated and demanded people to reckon with what they thought about this cause, and not just say, well, it's unpopular or it's never going to work, and actually start to rationalize themselves about what they truly believed about it. So Euland, when she takes the helm of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association, she does start to organize like her counterparts in other states in the Midwest, and then certainly in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Carrie Chapman Cat had been president in the early 20th century from about 1900 to 1904. She'll return as president of NASA in 1916, and she will work alongside women like Clara Euland to coordinate both a state-by-state campaign effort and also a national federal effort. So Euland develops a very similar style to Cat. She divides Minnesota into districts. She begins to connect with legislators in the state legislature, and she really starts to agitate and push. She gets suffrage speakers to travel the state. I follow one of them in one of the articles I've written, a woman by the name of Renee Stevens, who goes to Southwest Minnesota and agitates in counties that had never seen a real trained suffragist before. And so you can see momentum, you can see movement. Euland also helps plan a massive parade, the very first parade in the cities. It was a huge shift, really, when you think about, in the absence of activism or agitation in this public way, to a parade, and you see car caravans driving around in these areas that, again, had not had any real agitation. It's a huge shift. Along with Cat, Euland, eventually they try to secure, they are working towards some sort of amendment or some sort of bill that will enfranchise women. In the end, they settle on presidential suffrage. So that will give women in Minnesota the right to vote in presidential elections. It's not full enfranchisement, but it is something that does not require a statewide vote. And if you remember, that 1898 amendment had made that quite difficult. So this seemed attainable to Euland and the rest of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. And so this is really exciting for Euland and others. They continue to agitate. She continues to work not only statewide, but there's also other groups that she's a part of that continue to agitate. Just as the Every Woman Suffrage Club with Nellie Francis at the helm was working for suffrage, it again within this context of race and the Black community. Here we see the Minnesota Political Equity Club, a photo of its members here. Another excellent example of a group of women agitating in their local communities, looking at specific issues that matter to them, whether it was temperance or school reform or sanitary conditions in factories or in food service industries. whatever the case was, they would build their activism out of these local clubs and then bridge over time with other clubs to create a much more expansive network. It complemented what Ulen was doing, dividing up Minnesota into districts. It was quite helpful to start to connect with local activists and build on their already existing work. I would like to contrast the Minnesota Equity Club, which was largely white, prominent women, well-to-do or members of well-to-do families, with another club that I study in Southwest Minnesota. This is the News and Art Club of a tiny town in Southwest Minnesota called the News and Art Club, Minneota. This is an image of them from 1918. They actually had a pageant, and this is an image of them as they were preparing for this pageant that they were going to put on. This is an example of what I was talking about, of women who already had organized themselves around particular causes. And when suffrage speakers came to town, they were ready to transform themselves into suffragists, or at least build in suffrage into their already existing activities. So the News and Art Club is a federated women's club. And it's very active in its community. In 1918, this is during World War I, they were the leaders in the American Red Cross. They were leading the Liberty Loan drives. These women were, they were at the helm of a lot of war mobilization efforts, but they were also meeting and chatting about what they thought about the right to vote and how they could use the right to vote to continue to better their communities. A lot of them saw the right to vote as a patriotic war effort, or part of the patriotic war effort. And the way they see this, and the way this ultimately starts to shape their ideas about citizenship, is that they increasingly are concerned about those German immigrants who had been sort of an issue, or at least people had sort of been keeping their eyes on them. As World War I unfolds and it becomes increasingly clear that the United States is going to join the war on the side of the Allies and fight against Germany, any German immigrants or German Americans who spoke in favor of Germany were increasingly considered suspect. Were they going to commit acts of espionage? Were they going to thwart the war effort in some way? And if you read newspapers during this time, you'll see there are just rumors and accusations running rampant. When the United States officially joins World War I, German immigrants are suspect number one, and they really have to prove themselves. It's not required, of course, but because of this patriotic questioning of their loyalty, they really have to prove themselves. They buy more than the quota for Liberty Loans, for example, or they have to stand for the flag and show that they're true patriots and they don't have loyalties to their home countries. What's curious here is that these women are actually largely Norwegian, and they actually don't fit that profile. But one of the problems with World War I is this anti-immigrant sentiment. They don't necessarily distinguish among the various ethnic groups. So even though Germans receive the most vilification, Norwegian immigrants also faced persecution, or at least suspicion. So the News and Art Club, because it's comprised of a lot of Norwegian American women, they really have to walk a fine line. They are activated, they want to be suffragists, but they're also immigrants or the children of immigrants. And so they have to be very careful about how they act in this very tense moment. One of the ways they can do this, that they can show that they're patriots, or they can show that they're loyal, that they're not Germans at least, and they can support suffrage. It's actually a really great thing that Ulen and other suffragists create, is they call for clubs and associations to send resolutions to their constituent, or to their legislators, to show that the constituents want to have women's suffrage. And so the News and Art Club, along with 9 other organizations in tiny Lyon County — if you're thinking about Lyon County, it's Marshall is the county seat. This is not a hugely populated place. It's relatively remote. There are some railroads that go through it, but it's not certainly not a massive railroad hub at the time. But 9 organizations send resolutions, pro-suffrage resolutions. And these organizations are Red Cross auxiliaries, they're ladies' aid societies from churches, and they're federated women's clubs like the News and Art Club. And that's where I know they became suffragists, or they were at least publicly suffragists, because they passed a resolution. They're one of these groups that do this. So again, we can see that there's this question about immigration, that these immigrants that can't be trusted, especially this question about they were voting and they weren't citizens, but even when they become citizens, are they really truly loyal? This is a way that we can start to see how that question really aligns, and we start to see people grappling with citizenship. Passing resolutions publicly, buying Liberty loans, being part of this public demonstration and mobilization for World War I, that shifts the conversation in the Midwest about citizenship. Citizenship becomes something that you demonstrate. It's not just a passive status that the government doesn't care about or that your neighbors don't care about. Before this moment, people did not care whether you had naturalized, how long you had been in the country, but World War I changes that. And you have to prove yourself. And that demonstration or that behavior becomes the new standard rather than a petition or a declaration of intention. And I think that's a really important shift, and one that I think we're still grappling with as scholars, and even today, what that means in terms of the ethnic identities that are really, in many ways, one of the defining characteristics of Midwestern history and Midwestern life. My final point is also to talk about ethnicity, not just in Lyon County, but also within the women's suffrage movement. So the Scandinavian Suffrage Association, as you can see in this image, not only were they active in Minnesota, but they also were part of Alice Paul's National Woman Party when they started picketing the White House during World War I, which was very unpopular, I have to say, among members of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Carrie Chapman Cat was very upset that they were picketing, but they used this public demonstration. And again, for many women in Minnesota, these public demonstrations were so desperately needed that they were glad to join in this picketing. So some of them did picket, but also the Scandinavian Suffrage Association was very active, especially in the 19-teens in Minnesota, to agitate for women's suffrage, arguing that Scandinavian countries had a better record of enfranchising women, or at least giving women more equal rights, and having a better culture of gender equality. And so they come to women's suffrage in Minnesota saying that they bring with them and they cherish their Scandinavian or their ethnic backgrounds. And just as they did in Lyon County, they have to sort of grapple with World War I, so too does the Scandinavian Suffrage Association. They have to start to really figure out, now the Scandinavian Suffrage Association is obviously not German, but again, the distinction among immigrant groups is not necessarily happening during World War I. So they actually have to really consider what they're going to do. There is actually a vote at one point to change the name to the Women's Citizen Association. That vote fails, so they keep the Scandinavian name, but nevertheless, you can see that immigration and ethnicity directly intersect in Minnesota with questions about women's getting the right to vote. And again, I think it raises really important questions to us about how we define citizenship, and in particular, when we can think about moments when people, the way in which they express their citizenship changes dramatically. And so this research that I'm very happy to have presented with you, I hope it has given us ways of thinking and reconsidering women's suffrage and thinking about immigration and what sort of insights they can give to us as we, 100 years later, over 100 years later, that women got the right to vote, how we can look back on that legacy. So thank you very much for listening with me, and I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see everyone. And I would love if anyone has any questions or comments. I am happy to answer any.
So feel free to put your questions in the chat box, or there's also a button you can raise your hand, and I believe we can unmute you if you have a question or something that you want to share. So I did have a little bit of a question, Sarah. In your research, and we have an exhibition, a little plug for our exhibition that people can check out on our website about suffragists in Minnesota. But did you run into many clubs or working class women? This is something that we've been looking at and trying to figure out, the different classes, how they participated in suffrage.
Yeah, so I don't talk about it in my book, but there are historians and scholars who have looked at working class women. I'm trying to remember the name of it, and I'll see that Kristen Bloomberg is on the call, which is great. Hey, Chris. She might be able to help me. But there were organizations, especially in the cities, where working class, especially younger women, did agitate or begin to agitate for the right to vote. And what's really fascinating is it adds another layer to this question of the ways in which women come to the right to vote or demanding the right to vote, whether it's like Nellie Francis becoming an activist for suffrage on behalf of the African American community, or if it's this question of immigration and Scandinavian heritage. And in this case, there were a lot of young women who were working in higher numbers in the cities and were demanding the right to vote. It's part of a broader movement, questions about worker safety, working conditions, wages, equal pay or fair pay for work. So they build a case for suffrage out of those demands, that they want the vote so that they can secure for themselves better working conditions or better pay. And so it is another layer. And I think there's an article in Minnesota history that talks about this in more depth. So I would, if anyone's interested in that, I think you could read up on that, and that it's a really important point. And like a lot of I'll just add, like a lot of the younger suffragists who came to suffrage toward the end, 1913, 14, 15, and beyond, a lot of them are much more interested in these pressing issues for themselves, but also in being more direct. And a lot of them will work either with the National Women's Party or with the, excuse me, the Minnesota Equal Franchise League, which is much more interested in direct public demonstrations and displays to really galvanize Minnesotans. And so we see a lot of those labor activists also in that kind of work.
Great. Kristen, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. Is my microphone working okay?
It is.
All right. Yeah, I think Sarah had a great response to that question about labor. And I think it's interesting how the labor women and the wage earning women were interested in achieving political rights in order to achieve further economic rights. And I think that's a really understudied area of American history, and especially the larger women's movement.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, my question for Sarah was, I am wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how the ethnic women's involvement in Minnesota might have been similar or different to the national movement. And do you see Minnesota as being different from what we saw nationally, or maybe following along the same trends?
So I see somewhat of a tension in that I think sometimes they want to emulate. They're being told, frankly, by NASA that they need to, these are the messages you want to say. And we have evidence from these immigrant groups, these women who do get involved with suffrage, that they're like, oh, these are the speeches I have to say, or these are the words, these are the things we're supposed to say. But a lot of the messages don't totally fit with the reasons why they want to vote. And so what I have seen is there's some modifications, or there's some tensions in how they actually adapt. Do they choose to adapt, first of all? And then if they do choose to adapt the messages, how do they do that? So actually what's fascinating in places like Lyon County, and I've not looked at every county in Minnesota, so I'm sure there's some differences, but what they argue is that they can use the vote to protect their ethnic communities. And in these communities, what they want is they don't want their kids to go to public schools necessarily, or they don't necessarily want to have to support institutions that are not part of their enclaves. Like they want parochial schools, and they want to keep speaking their native languages in their churches, and they want to keep some control over how they can preserve their cultures, their ethnic identities. And so they argue what a lot of suffragists, especially suffragists who espouse these nativist arguments, they want immigrants to become Americanized and use the vote to vote for quote unquote American values. And the immigrants are going back to their communities to make a case for why they're, at this point, it would be immigrant men, why they should vote for women to get the right to vote. And they're saying, well, it'll help us because it'll allow us to now have power, and we can use our votes to preserve these ethnic communities and the institutions that we want, and prevent maybe other incursions of other forces into our communities. So that I do think there is a tension there that national suffragists, but they don't necessarily know that this is happening. And so that's not something they're necessarily commenting on, but looking at these groups, that's something that I find kind of fascinating, that they'll do that. The other side of this, though, is that because immigrants can vote in high numbers in the Midwest, either through declarant suffrage or just becoming naturalized, because there's so many first generation immigrants or second generation immigrants who have lived in these ethnic communities and who are voting within their particular values, suffragists are kind of put in a bind because they, in the Midwest, have to rely on the support of immigrant groups to get women's suffrage to pass if it's a broad state amendment campaign. But they also don't trust them, especially Germans. So for a long time, suffragists at the national level don't know what to do with immigrants. We've got evidence of they totally denigrate them in their public. They say speeches about how these immigrants, it's unbearable that they have all this power. But then on the other hand, they're like, but they vote, and we can't ignore them either. And so we have evidence, for example, of them translating their suffrage propaganda into many different languages because they also know they need to reach them and at least try to convince them to support the right to vote. And it works, like the News and Art Club. You can convince immigrants to become suffragists, or they'll become suffragists because they see the value for their communities. So that, I think, is a really fascinating tension, that you both need and don't want the help of immigrants.
So we have a question from Krista, and then we'll circle back to a couple of the other questions. Krista asks, excuse me, did you research derivative citizenship for women? The fact that women got their citizenship from their father or husband was so surprising to her when she found that out. How did that impact the women's suffrage history? And there was also a time when women lost their citizenship if they married an alien. And she's not sure when that policy ended. So if you can share what you know a little bit about that.
That is one of my favorite. Thank you for asking this question, because it is such a fascinating period in history, and it says so much about gender and citizenship. And I do talk about it in the book, and it did matter to suffragists. So derivative citizenship started in 1855. There was a measure passed just through Congress. There was hardly any fanfare, but it established basically what was a custom at this point, a custom derived by a system from English common law that had been transferred to the United States, system of coverture. Basically what this system's derivative citizenship said is that a woman became a citizen through marriage. So women could not be naturalized. They did not go through the naturalization process. It was only when their husband became a citizen that then they became a citizen. And so coverture, this broader system, the idea is that women are dependents, and their status derives from the independent or the sort of autonomous individual in the family, which would be a husband or father. And so derivative citizenship after 1855, when it's passed, it's in law that this is the practice. And suffragists are justifiably upset about this. It's not totally a major point. It's not something where a lot of them are talking about it. It's something that they'll touch on it occasionally throughout the 19th century. But they start to realize increasingly that this is a problem, and they do start to speak out about it. And then the act that you're talking about is the Expatriation Act, and it's passed in 1907, I think, 1906 or 1907. I think it's 1907. Anyway, what this says is that because of derivative citizenship, a woman derives her citizenship from marriage. So if a woman with birthright citizenship, she's born in the United States under the 14th Amendment, she has birthright citizenship, but she marries a foreign-born man and he does not have US citizenship, then she loses her birthright citizenship and she is no longer a citizen of the United States, which I share your shock. When I first learned this, however many years ago when I was doing my research, I was just floored that this was an actual policy, that you would strip a person of citizenship through marriage, just by the act of marriage. And this is a policy, it exists until about 1922, but not for all women and not for all marriages. The Cable Act officially ends this, and this is an act that is supported by suffragists, and then the League of Women Voters. When that emerged, they do push for the end of this particular issue, but it's not for all groups. So especially women who had married men of Asian descent, there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, which I think resonates right now and what we've been hearing in the news. And so in that community, if you were a woman with birthright citizenship and you had married a man of Asian descent who, especially if he was Chinese, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882, said that the Chinese could never become citizens. They could never naturalize. They were never going to be able to become citizens. So that woman, because of that provision, the Exclusion Act provision, that the Cable Act did not cover women who had married men of Asian descent. And so that comes later. I cannot tell you the date, but it does last for a number of years after 1922. So when I teach a class on citizenship to freshmen at Center College where I teach, and I really love talking about this because it's so complicated and frustrating and interesting and compelling. And one of the things I think this reveals is that we think that citizenship is ours, that we somehow claim it, or it's ours to have power over. And cases like this, it's not ours, it's the states, it's the government's. And if the government can remove and give citizenship in these very arbitrary ways, we have evidence, like it still happens today. So I think that's, for me, a really fascinating point. And I'm glad that you brought this up. It's a great question.
Yeah, I had no idea about that either. So thank you, Krista, for bringing that up. We're going to go back to Judy's question, and then we have a question from Molly. So Judy asks that it's clear that World War I and anti-immigrant sentiment played a role in suffrage. What about the 1918 flu pandemic?
Yes.
Very appropriate right now.
Also, you all, this is where I would tell my students, you all are on it today. These are great questions. No, so you're absolutely right. So when the flu pandemic bears down, and I'll talk about the Midwest, it is pretty devastating. In Lyon County, which is one of the counties that I've talked about and I study, there were really 4 women who took on the work that the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association had instructed to all the districts in all the counties. And I talked about the resolutions, how they wanted organizations to submit resolutions, and that was very popular, again, because it could help, especially immigrant groups, prove that they were patriots and not disloyal. But they also do a petition drive, and a big petition drive. And there's 4 women in Lyon County, and there are many women like this, where they go literally door to door and they try to secure petitions. And what the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association gave was a quota. So each county or each area had a specific number of names of signatures they wanted to get, because they wanted to be a majority of the voters who had voted in the last election to prove to legislators that they needed to support a women's suffrage, the presidential suffrage bill, basically. So they want to prove this, like, your constituents want this. We have resolutions and we have petitions to prove it. Well, the influenza pandemic hits. By the fall of 1918, we see a massive wave. And in the county that I study, Lyon County, 2 of the women come down with influenza, and it basically halts their petition drive. The other 2 women sort of limp along and do the best they can. They get close. In terms of women's signatures, they are 1 short of their quota, but Claire Euland writes them back and tells them, you did great work anyway. But it's like a testament to the difficulties that created. They also report, not only are they hamstrung by the flu themselves, but they say, well, there are a lot of places we can't go because they're in quarantine. So we want to get the signatures, but we can't have access to these communities or these households. Another state that I study is South Dakota. And there in 1918, they were having an amendment campaign, their 7th. This gives you a little perspective. In Minnesota, there were no amendments campaigns. In Iowa, there was 1. In Wisconsin, there was 1. But in Minnesota, there weren't. But in South Dakota, there were 7. And the 7th campaign was in 1918 during World War I, which is a very different context for how they fought for the right to vote. But Carrie Chapman Cat was scheduled to make an appearance in South Dakota for this amendment campaign, and she had to pull out at the last minute because she got influenza, and she was pretty sick. She certainly couldn't travel, but people were quite worried about her, that she was suffering from it, and they were concerned that she might have either significant health outcomes or even die. But she did recover, but it did hamper there was certainly a concern that it was going to hamper these specific campaign initiatives, and then it was going to affect more broadly. I think in the end, the previous question, the anti-immigrant sentiment in the Midwest was so strong. It was so powerful that one of the pieces of evidence I like to sort of just to give a sense of this, of the first 15 states to ratify the 19th Amendment, just over half were in the Midwest. The very first state was Wisconsin, a state that had opposed women's suffrage, just like Minnesota had done for a really long time. So to me, that, to kind of circle it back, when we looked at that map, right, Minnesota, Wisconsin, South Dakota, these were all states that the National Suffrage Association had written off. They had said, do not spend your time in the Midwest because it's full of immigrants and they're never going to support women's suffrage. And that's the thing that gets women the right to vote, is, well, now we can use that against, we can say these immigrants, we want to disenfranchise them, or we're going to use this nativism to press forward this idea that we should enfranchise women because they're patriotic and they're loyal and they're mobilizing for the war, they're supporting the American Red Cross, etc. So it's a kind of interesting, ironic twist.
That is, yeah. I don't know what to say about that, but it is really interesting. So Molly's question was there any history of Black and white women working together for suffrage in the country, or specifically in Minnesota?
So yes, they did. Nellie Griswold Francis, she knew Clara Euland. They were very much within the same or similar social circles. Certainly there were racial dynamics, but they didn't always agree on their efforts always, but it wasn't antagonistic always. And not only in Minnesota, we see, like in Chicago, there's a great study by Wanda Hendricks that looks at activism among African-American women in Chicago. And there were ways in which women had similar interests. And I think one of the things in thinking about these, especially club women, a lot of these clubs that we saw their photos, they came to suffrage often later, or often out of other interests like temperance, or a lot of these progressive reforms, beautification campaigns, natural spaces, parks, and that sort of thing was a big thing. Sanitation, pure food, that was another concern. That municipal housekeeping sort of captured a lot of the sentiments that galvanized people, that galvanized a lot of women. So even now club work was segregated. As I mentioned, there was National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and then there was the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which was white for white women. But they're not totally antagonistic. They adopt because they live next to each other or near each other, and because they share similar causes outside of suffrage, they can come together and work together. But I do have to say that that's when we look at like white supremacy, it is a message that increasingly we see used. So that does make it difficult to forge lasting relationships and lasting coalitions, because even though the 19th Amendment dramatically changed a constitution that was silent on issues of gender or sex, they did nothing on it. So it's a powerful intervention, legal intervention. It was meant for white women, and they knew that. The national leaders and even state leaders like Clara Yulin, they've recognized that this was not inclusive, even though they could be inclusive with other reform efforts.
Right. Thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, I was just reading a little bit about, well, I think you mentioned that, again, the ethnic, some racism, but about Clara Yulin, her thoughts about the Mexicans, I guess at that time, Mexican Revolution and people coming in to work, and she was not happy about that. But okay, I mean, that makes sense with the white supremacy and everything. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question.
I don't see any other questions. So thank you, Dr. Sara Egge. And I'm going to share a screen real quick. Please look up her book, Women's Suffrage and Citizenship in the Midwest from 1870 to 1920. And that's available. Who's the publisher again, Sarah? Remind me.
It's the University of Iowa Press.
Right. The University of Iowa Press, it's on their website. And it might be at Subtext Books, which is our partner in book sales for our History Revealed programs. And I want to give a little bit of a plug for our next program with the Eastside Freedom Library. Kim Heikkila will be coming and talking about her new book, Booth Girls, Pregnancy, Adoption, and the Secrets We Kept. We've had Kim talk before, and she's a wonderful speaker. And this is a story partly about her family and partly the history of the Booth Hospital in Minnesota. So join us for that one. And also please check out our website for our information on our Persistence exhibition. And there's a link there that will take you to the exhibition. We cover, we had some artists and some interesting information about Nellie Francis, Clara Yulin, and other suffrage leaders.